How's this go? Welcome back to Love the System, the integral stage sub-series devoted to procedures, protocols, politics, processes, and institutions, or what we pedantically call the lower right quadrant. I'm Layman Pascal, and one of the most common issues that people come to when they're trying to figure out the choke point in many of the world's problems is that of education, both in its narrow sense as the institutionalized training of youth, in its expanded sense as the ongoing self-cultivation of individuals, and maybe in a very expanded sense as the model or principle upon which all aspects of civilization could be based. So we're very happy to be exploring this today. I'm sitting down with Creston Davis to discuss the Global Center for Advanced Studies and his understanding of the needs and structures of improved human educational systems generally. Hi, Creston.
Hey, good morning. And by the way, in that intro blurb, you said the lower right quadrant. What is that? What are you referring to in the lower right?
So people, one of the communities we service is the integral theory community. And so a lot of it's centered around the work of Ken Wilber. And he made a model where you go subjective to objective and singular to plural. So that gives you sort of four methodological domains of like subjective experience, objective science, intersubjective relating, and then systems, interobjective relatings.
Okay, that's really helpful to know. And Ken Wilber is awesome. Like, I'm friends with him on Facebook, and we swap messages every now and again. He's great.
Hey, he's been a real pioneer on a lot of this stuff.
Definitely. Well, great. Well, Hola from Bogota, and you're in Canada, and that's Canada A, and sorry.
Or salut, bonjour.
That's great. Well, good. And so, yeah, I'm like 8,400 feet above sea level. And so the O2 levels are pretty tight. And my age at 50, you can start feeling that much more than I used to be able to. So anyway, it's all interesting experience.
If you get a little woozy, we'll know why.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like, well, okay. Anyway, good to see you. It's good to be here. And thanks, Bruce, for inviting me on. So
yeah, this should be fun. Why don't you give us like a quick sense of what GCAS is and when it got started?
Great. Yeah, sure. Well, as you may know, like there's a lot of stuff going on in education. There always is, right? And people are always trying to improve education. And sometimes you get sick of it, like, well, we can do it better and so on. Well, I was working as a professor at Rollins College and was promoted to an associate professor in 2012. But some of my students, while I was teaching there from 06 to 12, they started coming back to me, graduated. They had a great degree, good liberal arts college from Rollins. It's in Central Florida. And they couldn't find the jobs that they were qualified for. And so they were largely unemployed, not all, but most of them. And they had massive debt because it cost $50,000 plus a year to go to college. So I started looking into like, why is this the case, right? Where you sort of, a society set up to have education to not to put the youth into massive debt and tie them, hamstring them to a chair that they forces them into jobs that they're overqualified for and they really aren't inspiring. So I'm thinking on a social level, and of course, that's idealistic. I know there's some problems with that, but on a social level, in general, society shouldn't be like harming their youth and really delaying entrance into the full-on economy. And when they do enter, they're in massive debt, $50,000, $100,000 in debt, sometimes more. And so that really puts over time a generation, the millennials, the Gen Z, into more and more harm. And that can't be good for the economy overall. So I was thinking, is there a different model that we could use? Well, at the time, I sort of was snooping into this Bitcoin thing and started learning about decentralized technologies, disruptive technologies. Sometimes people refer to this as blockchain, although they're not the same. So I started looking into this and thinking, well, is there a way to put education, higher education, through a kind of blockchain ecosystem in a way that can start alleviating debt? So that was some of my questions. And back in, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago now, Slavoj Žižek and I, we still work together at Columbia University through a press and edited series. And we started talking about You asked for a paragraph, and I'm on like the 5th paragraph. I hope that you don't mind.
No, keep going. Let's see where this goes.
Okay, good. So Slavoj Žižek and I were talking in 2002 about like, what would a new Frankfurt School look like in the age of the internet, in the age of like ways of communicating differently. And so again, that started to kind of marinate in my mind, along with, how do you solve, or how can you create new technologies as a basis, an economic or financial basis through which you don't have to harm your students? Because I think it's like, as a professor, you're like, education is about liberation. It's about self-exploration. It's about finding the right questions, setting your quest for life in a different direction, in a way that you're not stupid, you're not banal, you're thinking deeply and critically about life in all aspects of what it means to be a human being. And if that's the case, then I'm sitting there giving some lectures on how to liberate the mind, or how history has, with tyrannies of like, rise of fascism, dictatorships, and how as a democracy, it's sort of a logic against this. And so it's all about emancipation or liberation in some ways. And yet at the same time, for them to sit in my class to hear that message and to be taught and be challenged by these kinds of ways of liberating minds and bodies, they have to go into debt to banks and to the government. So in a way, on the surface, it's already a contradiction as a professor. And that really started to bother me on a deep level. So in 2013, I voluntarily resigned from Rollins, took out my retirement, and put GCAS together, the Global Center for Advanced Studies in the United States, based on trying to solve some problems, based on what would it look like for using disruptive technologies, and how can we alleviate debt, and ultimately be true to the message of a professor, one who professes liberation. And how does that work in relationship to loving and caring for your students? So if that makes sense.
Okay, no, that's a great startup biography there.
Okay.
I was just thinking like, if you're friends with Zizek, maybe I should be sniffing and plucking my clothes to make you feel comfortable.
Yeah, that's right. And so on and so on.
So you've set this thing up where a different approach to financing using contemporary technology allows you to create a kind of free space where people aren't maybe ideologically and emotionally burdened by some contradictory elements of the system they're in while they're trying to develop their education. Were there other elements of traditional education that you saw as problematic that you've also tried to change, or is this basically just a change in the financing structure?
Well, no, it's a great question, because in the end, it's like what Karl Marx was after. It's about the substructure. The substructure gives rise to how we think. In other words, like our context materially, how we live, where we work, how we make love, how we worship, if we do, all these things, the material context determines how we think, our psychological ways of engaging others. So if you can change the context, financial, as well as if the financial context, material context, the economic foundation is geared for no debt education, and not just no debt. See, when our students graduate from our degree programs, we convert their tuition into ownership shares. So they're co-owners with faculty and other graduates, alumni. So if you flip it, and instead of them being in debt, they now have assets and co-ownership, and now they feel part of something. That infuses the learning environment in a way that I can't tell you that the difference is night and day, right? Further, because we do courses online, but also in person at various points in various places, we have folks from Uganda, we have researchers from all over the world, like Sri Lanka, Russia, you name it, 100 plus countries. And so when you're building a learning environment like that, okay, yes, there are downsides to online education. I get that. But there's also some interesting upsides, some of which we might not be aware of. For example, you're reading a common text. Let's say we're reading a novel like Dostoevsky, And you have different people from different economic, political challenges around the world. And we're engaged in this incredibly in-depth, psychologically interesting novel. You're going to have different angles coming to the classroom in a way that you would never have in a sterile classroom in the United States, say at Columbia, or where I went to Yale or Duke, because for you to even be in that space, you have to be privileged economically enough to fly to the US, to get accepted, to know English, and so on. Okay. And so all those things start to sterilize and immunize differences of angles that we love to explore in our classes, because you have folks who are super poor but super smart in our classrooms reading the same text together with wealthy people in the first world, so-called. And what does that look like? I get chills even thinking about it. I can't even explain to you the kinds of openness and the differences in the classroom. So what I'm saying to answer your question, once again, 17 paragraphs later, I'm just saying, like, if you create the environment and welcome those who are capable intellectually, then, and you're able to do that financially through a decentralized classroom, you're going to get learning in ways that you could never do ever before in the history of human civilization. And that is badass for me as a professor.
So the financial structure and the decentralized learning is enabling a much greater diversity and richness of people participating, and they're cross-pollinating each other and generating some kind of new learning environment.
Gosh, you know how to summarize. Like, where did you learn to summarize like that? That's did you do analytic philosophy as an undergrad?
No, but I dabble with it in my spare time.
That's incredible. Well, you're gifted at summarizing, because I just like to go off. And but that was great. That's a good summary. Yeah.
What do you see as changing in the project? Has it been, since it got started, kind of steady, or do you see it evolving? And if you see it evolving, what kind of direction is it trending in?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, it's taken us many years to tweak the model, right? At first, it was a nonprofit in the US, and the nonprofit sort of defaults back into a similar environment that nonprofit universities, traditional universities have as a corporate entity. And this because you have wealthy people on the nonprofit board who, in one case, our case, back in 2013 when we were founded, didn't want to be accredited. Okay, so we already are offering accredited courses in the European Union. There's a reason for that. We might get to it later. But so nonprofits are sort of like these for a successful nonprofit, you need pretty wealthy people generating the funds for it, at least to get it going. And those wealthy people have a vested interest in what it looks like for their own legacy. Okay, so it's actually not many nonprofits. Now, I can't speak for all of them, right? Because there are many successful ones, I'm sure. But in our case, an education nonprofit that was I founded in Colorado, then we moved it to Michigan. It really didn't work for us with respect to being able to tweak the model and open up courses for debt-free levels. They really wanted to already generate enough funding, which meant jacking up the tuition levels higher. And that went against the grain. So one of the core principles for us is debt-free. What does that mean? It means that you can have a part-time job and be able to get through a degree with us in a reasonable time without having to go into debt, right? And we work with people in different levels. In fact, our crypto token that we have that's on the Ethereum blockchain we developed allows folks who wouldn't even have a couple $1,000 per year for tuition, folks like in different parts of the world, to earn tokens. And they can earn tokens in various ways. They can do different tasks, create posters, help with social media. They can even be part of decision-making on the level of like academic council or whatnot. And they earn tokens. And then they can use those tokens to pay for tuition. If they have tokens left over when they're finished graduating, then we convert that to ownership shares with them, provided they meet the legal criteria for that in Ireland, because we are based in Ireland now. So going from the nonprofit in the US to Ireland back in 2017 was key for us, because it allowed us to open up a cooperative. It's kind of like a B Corp in California, a cooperative co-owned entity that's legally viable, and we own it together. That means that anybody who's part of GCAS, at the degree level, faculty, staff, financial supporters, we're all in this together. And that also changes the dynamic inside the classroom. If we're all in this together, then I have a vested interest to put my best foot forward academically, being prepared, reading the materials, engaging with other students in good ways as a cooperative way. So to answer your question, absolutely, our trajectory has changed a few times. We even partner with an accredited university in Slovenia, actually in Austria. I was the dean at the satellite campus in Slovenia, right by the border of Austria. And, at first it was working out really well, but then they wanted, tuition levels were higher and higher. And at a certain point we said, you know what, we need to incorporate in an entity that our community decides on, and in a place where we decide on. And we decided in Ireland for a number of reasons. One is Ireland never colonialized another country. And in fact, about 100 years ago, during the revolution, it overthrew and had its independence from the occupation of the Brits, the Protestant British. And to me, a space like that also matches our ethos that we're creating together. And it's an imminent process. Like, there's no telos. Like, we are the community that decides our own way, and not a board of directors who want to buy more and more property or hedge funds. We invest the way we choose. And that is a beautiful educational project that's also more of a cooperative project. And we even invest in students who create companies that are green in outlook, who try to address issues with our climate change, the temperatures rising. And we're investing in our own students to create these alternatives that look like what we're doing. So when they create an entity, we invest in that entity. They co-own GCAS because they've graduated. We also own part of what they're doing. And so it becomes like this beautiful network, an ecosystem of collaboration, of success. Now, everybody's not going to succeed, but that's okay, because we have a diversity of attempts and trials and working together. And that's also a beautiful next stage that we're now entering into. So there's a number of different iterations that we've gone through. We're still going to tweak it a few times, trying to keep this access as wide open as possible. We are trolled by certain alt-right communities that have tried to, infiltrate. In one case, did. So we know we have to have security, and that costs money, right? So there's certain thresholds that we have to hold up in order to be safe and to protect our own ecosystem for growth, and also not just growth in the capitalist sense of. For us, growth is about value. It's about how we understand our lives that are enriched by each other, by the content of what we're learning. We learn from people like Oliver Stone, people like Nobel laureates kind of teaching for us. Pulitzer Prize winners like Chris Hedges really adores what we're doing and supports what we're up to. So we have top professors around the world who work with us, and it's, for me, this is a way of life, and I love to live teaching philosophy, but also in a way, this whole ecosystem is doing philosophy. There's no separation from lives lived internal to our community and reading a beautiful philosophical intervention by, say, Jean-Paul Sartre or even Zizek, let's say, and so on and so on. Anyway, so yeah, it's beautiful. And where it's going to go, I don't know. We have great financial supporters who are progressive. They love what we're doing now that we're accredited, have some courses that are degree programs that are accredited in the European Union. We're moving in a good way. And we welcome those who want to be challenged intellectually and who also want to be challenged about how to work with others together to grow something beautiful.
What's your, I'm curious about this, is your internal decision-making structure. How do you guys go about deciding what you're going to do? Right. You're saying that it's somehow analogous to the philosophical process, right? Are you looking for consensus? Are there hierarchies? Is there ranked choice voting? Are there majorities? Or how is that laid out? How do you make decisions together?
It's a great question. And the answer is in two ways. One is we divide decision making up through the board. So we have a board who everybody on the board also is a professor who teaches, right? Which makes it really great because they're in the classroom. They're not extrapolated from it or removed and alienated from teaching itself as the art. And so there's the board, which is more like the executive branch. There's the academic council, which is more like the legislative branch. And then there's the vice chancellor, who it's quality assurance, making sure that we can do better at teaching and evaluations and hiring the right kinds of folks. And so that's the typical university structure as it is, right? So the president's at service of the board. I serve as a chancellor. So I serve at the service of the board. And for us, the issue is liability risks. We want to mitigate any kinds of things that might get us into some troubles. We've avoided that, obviously, very well, because we played that on the conservative side, as you can imagine. And then the academic council, it's made up of professors, department chairs who make decisions, meet up once a month, and they make decisions about and recommendations, budget. We're moving into the phase where they have a budget committee and all that. I don't want to get too heavy into the logistics here, and then there's the vice chancellor who holds both in check. So there's like a three-way check and balance. So that's one side. The other side is our stockholders, our shareholders, and the shareholders can also vote in relationship to the stock or ownership percentage that they have. So if we say want to invest in a campus, like buy one of those villages in Italy selling for $1 or something like that, which would be brilliant, right? How do we do that? Do we have the resources? And if we do, then we bring it to a vote. So it's democratic in a way, and it's also checks and balances. So there's two sides to that, if that makes sense.
Sure. What kind of faculty and teachers do you find you're attracting? Do they have any common characteristics? Who really wants to be in on this?
It's a good question. Like, you have so many PhDs without jobs, or if they want a job, the majority of them get these adjuncting jobs that they're overstressed and underpaid, and that over time affects the quality of teaching, no matter how good they might be at teaching. Right? They could be just absolutely brilliant and exquisite in the classroom, leading from one theme to a motif and back again, and so on, and managing a beautiful conversation, which I love to do. But if they're adjuncting over time, they're teaching way too much, they're grading way too much, and over time that starts to tax them and their ability to be artistic in class. Keep in mind, teaching is not a science. There's not like an ontological rule of natural law of you put students in a classroom and they come out cookie cutter with certain learning outcomes. Teaching is an art form. And to keep that art form going, you need to have the leisure to be able to free your mind up to explore yourself. And so what kind of people are we attracting? We are attracting really high quality, fresh, new PhD folks like Isabella Millar, who just graduated, I think, a year and a half ago, in January of 2020. And, people like that who are super gifted. She's already published a book with her dissertation. But we're also attracting top high-level professors like Braha Ettinger. She's one of the top artists in the 21st century, and certainly in female artists. And she's also a psychoanalyst who worked with like Felix Guattari, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and many others, Levinas. And so she's teaching for us. Jameson Webster's just taught a seminar for us. So really high quality teachers who have lots of experience, along with new, fresh PhDers who are learning the art of teaching. So that together, it gives the students a real way, fresh material, but also saged teaching. Yeah. So we actually have so many more inquiries about teaching for us that we had to open up a research fellows so that folks could join it with us, because we just didn't have enough faculty positions, just because we want to be careful with how we financialize this. We don't want to overstretch ourselves in the name of charity, but then collapse from within if we're not capable of maintaining our promises. So we created a research fellow, and as we grow, we move folks from the research fellow into faculty positions, or, for example, recent Ph.D. graduates from us, will teach undergrad courses as well sometimes. So, yeah, but it's top quality. I mean, you have to really be published at the leading edge of your field. Also be a good person who wants to be a collaborator rather than just an ego maniac, which is what the academy is designed to create, these monsters, right? These professors who only write books, and they might be on faculty at like an Ivy League, but you'll never get to talk to them as a student because they're just publishing and publishing. And, these schools rely on ratings by like US News and World Report. Come on, give me a break, right? But they're relying on these ratings, and to get higher ratings, you have to publish, your faculty have to publish, not just publish, but publish in top academic journals, but, in academic presses as well. So you get this pressure on the faculty to publish, but then at the expense of the students, right? And of course, students should be exposed to cutting edge theories, understanding like the difference between structuralism and post-structuralism and phenomenology and these kind of things in ways that advance human knowledge and ultimately better human democratic ways of working together to solve, one impending problem, global climate change, right? This is key. And so the academy itself is geared to put students into harm financially. Like, you hear this rhetoric, we care and we teach for the whole human being. Yeah, except for the economic side, right? And that's a key, as we talked about. It's if you don't have the economic infrastructure, you're never going to have the freedom to read and to explore. But the pressure is so much on these students that they don't take the humanities. The humanities themselves are in threat because they don't get jobs. They don't coordinate to jobs, even though the most innovators in our education or in our economic sector are those who are creative thinkers. And creative thinkers come from the humanities because, you have the sciences, that's necessary for life. But art lifts us up further. And art creates new angles and new creative spaces. So if you can free that up inside the classroom and inside of a degree program, working with the faculty, then you're going to get advancements of human knowledge over time, exponentially. And some of them we're just starting to realize as students start to develop, new programs, new platforms, new ways of decentralized technologies. It's amazing. And so, in short, our faculty have to meet up with their student once a month, at least, in a 1-hour conversation like we're having, talking about not just life, but also like in the challenges, but also like the material and how that relates. And so it's a beautiful model. It's certainly not the definitive model, and we're working on it. Obviously, for me to say it's the absolute model, like would be problematic, because we're always on the move to improve. Wow.
Seems like, the motives for higher education are sort of there's an uneasy set of tensions there between the desire to get an education, the desire to get some impressive certificate that you can leverage in the market, and the desire to get a set of useful social connections for the rest of your life. And the traditional institutions maybe have leaned too far towards just taking a lot of money from people, leveraging their futures and selling them an impressive certificate. Alternative educational institutions often lean too far the other way. They provide you a really rich, high quality education that you can't necessarily use for anything. So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah.
I know you've taken a lot of the pressure off with removing the debt thing, but how do you make sure people are getting something they can leverage in the world going forward?
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm glad that you're able to see some strengths and weaknesses on both sides. And you rightly identify some weaknesses of alternative education, high quality education, as you mentioned, but then what's the outcome? And, there's two ways of answering this. One is, what do our graduates do? How successful have they been? Well, our first PhD graduates have all gotten jobs in the academy. One is a department chair at MIU in Iowa. Susanna Livingston just was made principal in a very good high school. And then Stephen Bueno has received jobs from Villanova. He's and has been interviewed recently for a tenure level job. So, and that's even before our PhD was accredited. And in terms of our master's degree, because we just recently graduated a set of bachelors, our first beta of 5 or 6 bachelor students. I'll talk about those in a second, but our master's degree students have all gotten into really good PhD programs or advanced professional programs at top schools. So on that level, we're far and away succeeding immediately, right? And in terms of our bachelors, one started a company in Costa Rica and is doing very well. And he started this in part because he had the confidence of our community saying, yeah, you're really good. He's super smart. But he worked in the tech sector in Germany, and his intelligence was so insulted in a way that it was dysfunctional for him. So for him to find a community like we had that could foster his confidence and build on his intellect and his courage to create something new is phenomenal. And our other bachelor's degree students, well, actually, Cade is gotten into our Cade graduated with a bachelor's in September and is in our master's program. And a few others still have yet to finish their bachelor's thesis. For you to graduate from GCAS, you have to write a 10,000 word bachelor's thesis and take several comp exams demonstrating that you can think critically. And these comp exams are you're in a conversation with Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Socrates. Create a narrative about that and solve the question of justice in relationship to these 3 figures or whatever, or how does feminism register in relationship to these philosophical outlooks? And so you really need to know what you're doing for you to graduate from GCAS. So our standards are much higher than the traditional schools. And I think that we first attract those who are courageous, who are more likely to take risks. They're world travelers. All our bachelor's degree students have traveled the world. They know what's going on. They're in their late 20s, early 30s. They never finished a traditional model. And so we welcome that. That's assets in the classroom for us to learn. It keeps us on our toes. One of our bachelor students right now, our poet and laureate, is Katrina, and she's on the border of Belarus and Poland right now, working with human beings, not refugees. They're human beings in freezing to death at night, children. So she's there. She's creating poetry. She's a published poet, and she teaches. What's really was interesting last year, our bachelor's students, of which we accepted 10, and I think 7 are finishing, and they all co-taught a course together. It's okay, but at a high level standards, at the level of standards that you would expect at any undergraduate, in fact, even higher. And they were just brilliant working together, reading texts that they wanted to read. Of course, at some point you have to steer it, but they were just phenomenal. And so to sit back and watch that and be part of that as a professor was just amazing. So there's many highlights I can talk about, but to answer your question in the first way, let's look at the results. Like where are people getting jobs, or are they? And where are they getting into advanced degree programs? And in every case, we're succeeding. This is before we were accredited. So now that we are moving into more accredited programs, imagine where that would go. Now, that is also a downside for us because we want to widen how many people we bring in. But at the same time, we want to make sure that, we can eat with them for 20, 30 years down the road. We can, we're part of their lives, and they're part of our lives in a way that's healthy, obviously. So, and then the other side is like, how does it impact? The other side is this, like, if we can create a disruptive education model that's offering accredited courses at a global level in the European Union, then doesn't that give an incentive to our students, or what we call researchers, because we're all searching, searching again, researching, like a refrigerator keeps recooling the air, right? Researching. So we're all researchers. And doesn't that give them the ability, because they're not strapped with debt, they now have assets to be courageous and bold about new ways of living in the world? Now, not creating communes, perhaps, or going into an island in the Pacific and just living off maybe, but for us, it's a question of the cooperation, the network, the ecosystem, the people. What does that do? And as we grow, the value of our collectivity grows. And where can you take that? And that's what's really exciting at the early stage. We're 8 years old, 8+ years. Who knows where we'll go? But I think because of the boldness of the model, it gives our researchers and our community members the courage to think through other disruptive possibilities that are solving problems in the world today.
You must be primarily focused on your own project, but I'm curious about your relationship to other groups of disruptive institutions and other sets of circulating searchers. How do you think about that? Do you think there's a need for networking and collaboration between emergent educational experiments?
There's no doubt that it's our historic situation is growing dire by the year. The temperatures are rising, and along with that, in correlation to that, is the rise of more authoritarianisms, more dictatorships. I mean, you could see the Constitution of the United States was nearly burned recently. Okay, and so you do have this with the pressure of the climate, temperatures rising. More the folks who have ownership of the majority of wealth are clamping down, and the way you clamp down is you create dictatorships. And so, where are our resources going to be if the state's institutions are so weakened by neoliberal politics, by putting people into massive debt, by wars, by burning more fossil fuels, and not really investing in new green, clean energy possibilities? If that's the case, then the only resource we have, if the state doesn't help, okay, and I'm not saying the state's not totally helping, okay, but if the state's not there in the way it used to be in terms of a liberal democracy, then the only resource you have now is collaborative. And you must then, therefore, start building decentralized autonomous nodes in a network that collectively gives us the resources we need to create a life that's cleaner, that's healthier for the future generations today, right? So that's the key, is the collaborative moment. If we can create a model like this that's legally compliant within state regulations in the Republic of Ireland and compliant elsewhere as well, right? But at the same time, creating opportunities that breaks walls down, right? So for example, we have some students in Iran, they can't pay in fiat, dollars or euros because of the embargo. So they pay in Bitcoin. Okay. It's these kinds of possibilities that build a collaborative resources that must grow if we're going to have a chance, because in the end, the state's not going to fold unless unless you have a larger resources putting pressure on the state to rebuild those vital institutions that takes care of human beings, not the wealthy 1%. So we are in collaboration with accredited universities, one in Brazil, one in Mexico City, accredited institutions, but also other institutions like the New Economic Thinking Tank and others besides. And we need more collaborative growth networks to build those resources that are vital for in the end, it sounds apocalyptic, but vital for the survival, if maybe not our generation, but maybe the folks that are coming up, the Gen Zs. I mean, they're desperate, and no wonder like a lot of them just give up. The millennials, the Gen Zs, they just give up. They're like trapped. They have to go to college. They have to get debt. Then they have to get a corporate job because they have to pay back their debt, as opposed to suppose they come out of an education, they're not in debt. They actually have assets that are growing as we grow. And therefore they have time. They don't have to get that corporate job or that job at McDonald's. They can create, they have the time and resources to build, and the network of GCAS to build, and other collaborative projects to build something more interesting that's more healthy for everybody.
Yeah, I like that a lot, because we don't know what kind of civilization disruptions are coming up pretty soon, but it's going to be one or more of them. And so networked people who have more room to grow and root themselves and see what the possible solutions are going to be seems to me to be absolutely essential. One of the experimental educational institutions that's been getting a lot of press the last couple of weeks is this idea of the University of Austin. So the concept seems to be to try to provide a free speech oriented U.S. college that can bring in people who've been, kicked out of other places and educate outside the influence of the culture war, which is a great idea. But obviously, a lot of people are worried about whether it's going to have a not so secret conservative leaning, and where's the money coming from and things like that. Mm-hmm. Do you think there is a problem in American academies that a culture of fragility and conformity and intolerance for innovation and, problematic individuals is being created? And second question is, what kind of advice would you give to the people who are starting up the University of Austin to just help them steer a good course and not fall into some of the traps that might await them?
Wow, that's a great question. I really applaud any new institution that wants to make a break from, say, the traditional, and I would say stale and banal model, and even toxic model. So I would applaud the first step to think about creating that space, and the University of Austin is taking that first step. I think it remains to be seen if the funding will end up showing up at this early stage, but the idea is there. And the idea in some way is at first glance attractive. Like, let's create that space where professors can say what's on their mind, and without being encumbered by how their students might be offended by the material, right? So I think the politically correct, if you will, a model inside the classroom has really hampered research and ultimately really interesting and important conversations for young people to be part of. But unfortunately, just for a moment, the traditional model is so set up that if you're paying $50,000, $60,000 a year, and you already have this disposition of entitlement as a student, and so in a way, if the professor becomes your manager, your ego manager, and if it disrupts your sensibilities as a student who's paying $60,000 a year, that becomes a liability risk for the university. And therefore, you clamp down on professors who are making bold, interesting, maybe even offensive claims on the right or the left. And so for me, this University of Austin is trying to, I think, ameliorate that or circumvent that kind of environment to create more academic freedom spaces where you might get offended at learning. Well, I'm sorry to say, learning is tough. Calling your own assumptions that you've had for 18 years growing up in your family into question is really difficult. And because of the psychological fragility, 60% of undergrads are on some kind of pharmaceutical drug having to do with psychological issues, right? Because of the fragility there, it becomes a liability on that level of just psychology. So I think the University of Austin's, has a really interesting first step. The question will be, is it just is it just a hidden agenda behind it of like, we only want to have a conservative khaki wearing, button up, polo shirt wearing environment for the wealthy or for the privileged white people? Okay. Now, I'm not saying that's what they're doing. I'm just saying like the danger could be, well, if we can't survive in the plural environment, however that is plural in a traditional university setting, then let's create a sterile one that everybody looks the same, so we can pat each other on the back and have a love fest in the classroom, in the sense of everybody agreeing to the same positions. And that to me is not learning either, right? So if you're surrendering and circling the wagons, that also is problematic. So, and then the other thing about University of Austin, University of Austin, there's like an Austin College in Texas. There's the University of Texas at Austin, and then there's the University of Austin. So it'll be interesting to see if that doesn't become a legal issue. I don't know. But if it doesn't, okay. But it'll be interesting to see, what kind of professors they're putting out there. If they're controversial professors, that can be a good thing, but it also can be problematic. Who knows? Maybe it's just, I don't know. We'll have to see. And then also just look where the money's coming from. I think Cisco Research nonprofit is one of the big funders. And if you look at what they're up to, they love the free market ideology. And of course, we know code word for free market ideology is make sure the wealthy few maintain their wealth at the expense of everybody else and call it free exchange. Well, it's not, at a certain point, I mean, the wealthy few who owned a lot of the factories since the 2000s have sent 6 million jobs overseas. So there's more stress on our economy because they refuse to pay taxes and labor costs about what it means to be part of the United States of America. So who knows where all this is going to go? My guess is, I wrote a little piece on this. My guess is the outlook doesn't look good from the beginning, given their rhetoric, and if they're putting students into debt, if they're charging the same or equal, more or less the same tuition costs as aspirant universities or colleges, then you're not solving the problem. You're recreating a new one. So,
yeah, I largely agree. I commend their attempt. I think they're making a great first step. I like a lot of the people who are involved, but there's a real tendency, I find, at least in the United States, to discuss this problem of fragility in the institutions as if it was the contamination of a postmodern ideological belief that's somehow gotten into everyone's brains. And there may be something to that, but a lot of that fragility seems to be downstream of the corporate and economic structure and the attempt to, service the egos of people who are paying you a lot of money to be there, and then creating an administrative structure that has to reinforce that rather than protect teachers or the educational process itself.
Wow, that's so good. I wish I could. I'm going to definitely quote you on that. That's a fantastic way to put it. Yeah, that's right.
Now, how do the people at GCAS think about politics? Because you could look at University of Austin and go, well, it seems like it might be leaning a little bit to the right here. But then you look over, well, these guys are talking about Foucault, they got Zizek, they got Badiou. There's maybe a radical left element in a lot of this. Does that concern you? Are you worried about being too political? Is balance important, or is somehow all of that the wrong question?
No, it's a great question. I think it's an important one. First, we are secular. We don't committed to any one ideological way, religiously or politically. Now, it's true that a lot of what we do, we read radical thinkers because we want to be challenged by them. But we also read radical thinkers who would be located on different spectrum placements and on the right. And we have folks who are veterans, who are our students, who would tend to be more on the conservative side. And that's important to have in conversations in classrooms. I think that for us, the model that we've offered attracts certain people, right-wing libertarians sometimes, but also left-wing anarchists. And because of the model, we choose through our application procedures the best applicants who are capable of thinking clearly, critically, regardless of whether we agree with their political agendas, because we feel like that's important, different conversations to have in the classroom. And learning how, and this is something that I think the traditional university has failed miserably in, learning how to have different conversations of differences and disagreements in a civic way that is respectful of the fundamental nature of the people in the classroom with you. And I think our collaborative ecosystem at a financial foundational level, as well as our plural levels of who's part of what we're doing, actually creates that respectful environment. So yeah, we read the so-called radical lefties, but we also have, why do we read them? To be challenged. Are they right? Nobody has the so-called answers. There's no God telling us how to write scripture from the top down without a problem. But also, other folks who might challenge the status quo of, like, say, progressive politics, in the name of, say, maybe more conservative financial structures. That's important to have those kind of conversations. And how does that relate to social discourse? I mean, this is the problem with the culture wars that we have today and the massive divide, and why people are buying this big lie of what, say, with the recent Trump issue with lost the election, but he still thinks he's the president of the United States and so on. And a lot of people, millions of people are buying into that. And we want to break that. We want to break the psychological need to rely on other people's sources that may be dangerous. And that means that you as an individual must think for yourself. You must know what sources you're working with and what the ideological, what's the ideological impact, pressures that are coming through those texts, so that you as a human being aren't baptized in the name of an ideology, a communist or a socialist or a capitalist, but you are as an individual as a human being that can flourish in your own way, in your own journey of life. So to stamp them with like some ideological, like, congratulations, you've passed your degree program, you have a bachelor's degree, and now you're a full-blooded, like, card-carrying communist or anarchist or whatever. Like, this is not education. This is indoctrination. And that's what we have essentially in the mainstream universities. They're indoctrinated into the free market ideology that you are a slave to the owners of the modes of production. Now, that sounds Marxist, but I don't see, if you tell me another narrative that makes more sense, then I'm up for the discussion. But to us, it's like, if we were the owners of power, you and I, and we wanted to maintain control, how do you do that? You put people into harm's way of undermining their resources, put them into massive debt so that when they enter the job market, they actually are forced into taking positions with terrible working conditions, or working conditions that have nothing to do with their skill sets. That, to me, that's a way of maintaining control if we're the ones in power. So if that's the case, then how do we reverse that to free people up to create for themselves their own think tanks, their own way of life, their own skill sets that they can hone in on and trust and be confident in, and don't have to go to the bank, crawling to the banks for loans or the credit card. It's about developing a character to live in a world where we live in a way that's not top down. You are this, you must conform to that. What would it look like for an education to be truly open and truly free. Now, there's maybe no such thing, but we try to get as close as we can with that. And if somebody suggests a different text, then we entertain that idea. We're part of a larger conversation with everybody who's involved in GCAS.
I mean, the aspirational goal of individual critical thinking has always been a part of liberal academies, but it seems like it's more important than ever, not just because the implicit ideology of the economic system is trying to sell us something, but every single incoming message through our digital media systems is skewed to try to get us to think something and feel something right now. So, more so than what any of our ancestors faced, we have to be able to disengage from the implications of incoming signals. So that seems like, it might have been a Taoist luxury 1,000 years ago, but it's a basic survival skill now.
Wow, that's such a good way to put it. And you're right. Good examples are Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, all these social media sources that are reading our minds. The Cambridge Analytica, who basically predicted Trump's first win because of profile and how they can market and how they can create a it's like, in a way, it's like a psychological warfare when we enter spaces like that. And if we're aware of those and we're critical, then we're going to do better. We might not be the healthiest people living through that social media. I think, in a way, we're definitely all been damaged by this, right? And we don't even know the extent of the damage. But a lot of people have a lot of data on all of us. And what is that data going to do? How is it going to be used? And we know if there's profits to be made, that data will be used to make those profits. And we'd like to think, or perhaps I think a different, better way, and I'm suggesting this, would be, well, what about the health of the world? What about the health of our communities and the least among us? That's what, in the end of the day, when you're finished living your life, if that's what you live for, that's a life well lived, even if you're going to never succeed, even if you don't succeed, right? So in my mind, pessimistic as it may sound, we're going to lose this, okay? Because profits, the wealthy few, there's a handful of men in the world who own like 60% of the total wealth, right? I love the comeback story. I'm a true blood American in this way. I love maybe this isn't American, but this is like how we were taught what American, by that I mean United States of America. And the comeback kid or the comeback woman who overcomes patriarchy and succeeds in the corporate world or whatever it is. I love the comeback story. But in my mind, the gambit or the deck is stacked so far against us, polluting the environment to people making trillions of, even Elon Musk recently is taunting, oh yeah, you show me how I can solve global poverty with $6 billion and I'll give it, right? He's taunting. He might be right, but he's still, it's this arrogance that's there. And this arrogance filters down through, dictators and institutions that are weakened by it. And in the end, I think we're gonna lose this war. But I'll be damned if I'll stand on the sidelines and continue teaching in a traditional university setting, teaching the same damn courses, putting my very beloved students into debt. I'll be damned if I stand on the sidelines. I'm going to do what I can try to do and fight standing up and not living on my knees. And we might lose this. We probably will. But there's miracles. When people get together, like you look at World War II, the threat of the Nazis and the threat of the Japanese. And there are ways of working. There's ways of collaborating. There's ways of miracles happen when human beings show up. I don't know if you've ever lived through a national disaster, a hurricane, but when these things happen, like you put down all your resentments of your neighbors and all their political divides and all your differences, and you cut a tree up that's in the middle of the road and you work together and you eat together. Like that's the kind of environment I think we need to be thinking and fostering. And I think GCAS, along with other institutions, are helping foster that.
What would make GCAS more capable of doing that than it is right now? And I'm thinking of two things, like one on the structural side, what could you be doing? But also in terms of course material, like What is no one teaching yet at GCAS that you think is important that you would love for there to be a great course on?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that we can scale and improve and things like that. But I'll be honest with you, like one way is like, if you are listening to this and you want to be part of what we're doing and you have some, you want to be an owner of GCAS, we will welcome that, a conversation about that. Now, it's not a public offering. What I'm doing, it would be illegal for me to make a public offering for any investment. You can't do that. It's a private company. But if you get to know who we are and you like what we're doing, then we could certainly use help with folks' financial side, whether it's donations or becoming friends with what we're doing. So that's huge for us in many ways. But in terms of the more like what other courses I'd love to be teaching, like I would like to be teaching more business courses, like creating more savvy, more interesting ways of thinking through business and finance. Then there's I mean, you do need to know the sector industry and the practices within the sector. But you also, I think in an environment like what we're fostering, you can create different ways. We're in the process of creating a bank for our students and our community members. So we need courses that can teach us how to do that better. And also, I mean, we're not, because of COVID, we're still online for the most part. I mean, we're going to do something here in Bogota on Thursday that's a collective. We did something in Mexico City a couple of weeks ago, and we're starting to move back into more in-person course learning. But, the arts are really important, and we don't have a lot of that when you teach online. How do you create, when you're creating something, a painting or sculpture, that psychologically is part of you, and you're growing through shape, and you're growing through medium, and you're feeling what's going on. So those kinds of tactile things are really important to a life of a good college. Can you think of any? Would you suggest any? I'd be curious.
Well, it's hard to say. I don't have an immediate mental command of what course material you have already all set up.
Yeah, sure.
But I would think that a lot of the, some kind of more secular version of some of the basic skills that are promulgated historically as Dharma or esoteric religious teaching, somatic awareness and intention training and meditational self-regulation, that those are huge skill sets. And I think they give us a step forward in bringing together multiple domains of knowledge in a productive way.
You're so right. Like our Eastern side is so underdeveloped. We're still Western. I mean, we're still knocking at the door of post-colonialism and decolonializing education from the North to the global South. But the global East and the global Southeast, we have a center in Jakarta, but we really do need to expand that. And our resources are limited. So you start with where you are. But yeah, that would be, I'm glad you brought that up. And it's something I've thought of before, but it's interesting why I didn't think of that immediately. So that's really important for us to keep tabs on and be reminded about.
There's an interesting segue question there, which is like, how do you think about what wisdom is? What makes wisdom different than just knowledge and skill acquisition?
Wow. Yeah, this is a really important philosophical, I think, question. And I mean, again, for me, where coming from my own experience, I grew up as a Christian. I'm no longer one, and also in the West. So like reading Plato about wisdom and the sages and so on. But it's a good question. Like I would say, just to throw it out there, wisdom is being able to discern paths that are presented in your life that in a way that might be painful, but are healthier, decisions that are healthier for you as a human being and for your loved ones, those around you, as opposed to knowledge, which sort of is like, I know what category theory is. But wisdom is, you're right, it's somatic, it's bodily, and it's a question of how you eat and how you act what do you tell lies? Do you deceive? How do you interact with others with word and deed? Wisdom is, I think, what gives us the capacity to make the better choices in life. Maybe that's too existential. What would you say to my definition, and how could we improve it? See,
what I like about your definition is it sort of speaks to the question of who's a source of potential wisdom, like what makes a person trustworthy as a source. So their integrity and the way they've handled life choices and things like that. I talk with John Vervaeke at the University of Toronto a lot. He's very focused on the metacognition element, which I think is important. But also I think you'd get most of the things we call wisdom if you mixed normal education with a deep awareness of cognitive bias structures. Like being able to think outside of the things that hack our thinking, I think turns education into wisdom in most cases, even though there's a lot of somatic and intention training skills that are still required there.
That is a great definition. And would you say that there's like practices like meditation or these kinds of practices that maybe not are required, but would be helpful in being able to think outside the binary? Because I know sometimes when I meditate, things come to me in a way when I'm so stressed, like I can only do option A and option B. So in a time of meditation, sometimes I run long runs just to sort of work through things. Other options emerge. I don't know. What are there practices that can help with wisdom that you would recommend?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think there's a huge literature and history of wisdom development practices in what we might call the contemplative religions over history. And we could probably, reduce that down to a handful of core skills that they all have to use. Definitely attention on purpose, intentional attention, and being more precise in that way, the ability to regulate yourself and to, move your mind and your brain outside of its stress reaction modes, which is a little bit like taking that burden of debt off a person, right? It's the cognitive removal of student debt in a way so that they have the opportunity to think. And another feature, there are two more features. One is, I think, the role of the subconscious is tapped in certain meditational experiences and exercises, just as it is in art, because a lot of what we need to figure out doesn't just come from the conscious intellect foyer of the mind. And then there's a lot of embodied meditation type practices that I think personally, the drawing together of multiple subjective subsystems into some kind of extra coherence is normally how I think of spiritual practice. So, embodied yogas and practices, anything where you can use more than one part of yourself and get them aligned, that leaves you in a better position to be who you are with integrity going forward.
That is incredible. Wow. What a beautiful way to summarize that, but also like it just triggers a lot of more interesting thoughts that I would never have today because of that. I remember teaching a class on surfing, the spirituality of surfing, because I surf. And what a wave is it's really a response to the cosmic, gravitational forces, but the way the cosmos is working. And when you're surfing, that energy of the cosmos actually flows through you. And I think that's one of the reasons why people just get caught up on surfing. And being able to be aware of that and being aware of the cosmic forces around us and how they work through our bodies in different ways. But I like also, finally, what you just said about, like, you made an analogy between if you alleviate the debt, it frees up the stress pressures. Okay, that's a financial side. And that relates to the psyche. Fine. But then you were saying something like, but if you offer, what was the analogy? Sorry if I'm not getting it right. The financial alleviate debt, but if you offer different ways of knowing through the body, this also can alleviate the psychological pressures of only seeing different small options in one's mind.
I think stress and fragmentation between our internal systems is something of an analogy to debt. So if we can overcome that, then we at least have the opportunity, the space to try to be more who we are.
That is interesting. And so it's like I mentioned earlier, something like a statistic of about 60% of undergraduates are under like psychological pharmaceutical drugs. And there's a lot of stress there. Success, I think, there's a lot more stress, I think, than when I was growing up in the 80s. I went in the Army, and I knew I would be successful, whatever. It didn't bother me. But I think there's a lot of stress that you put yourself on Ritalin or these kinds of ADHD drugs. And that stress can cripple somebody, not just pharmaceutically. And I'm not against pharmaceuticals, obviously. I went through a tough time where I needed some assistance on that level, and that was fine. It really helped. But over time, the super stressful environments that I think are part of the educational world, if you can create different alternatives than maybe all just defaulting to pharmaceuticals by doing meditation, by doing yoga, or by doing art, therapy, that's, I think, part of addressing it. And so now I understand where you got the question, like other courses you'd like to be teaching. And I can start to see now the need for these kinds of possibilities. What my fear is, the fear flag that gets hoisted on the mask now in my mind is, we don't want to be, have gurus or have these kinds of hierarchies of like, oh, that person's the guru and much wiser than me, and therefore I'll go study. That can be helpful in different environments. My colleagues, Peter Sloterdijk, he went to India after he finished his Ph.D. and worked with a guru, and that changed the way he saw the world. He came back in the early 80s and wrote The Critique of Cynical Reason, which was the best-selling book since Mein Kampf in Germany. And he's changed the way German philosophy is done. Great. And it's largely influenced by the guru he worked with. So how would you think about a higher education institute like, say, GCAS, with the worry of, well, if we do these kind of things, then we create these kinds of hierarchies, these kinds of maybe culty-like environments? How would you address that?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. And part of it is, what do you think you'd be capable of implementing as a solution, right? I think the safest one is you just do it in small amounts and you do it with secular terminology, right? This is applied cognitive science. This is right. You take it outside of the realm of the discourse of spirituality and magic, although that might be an interesting thing to have in a, comparative spiritual praxis course or something like that. Beyond that, the more difficult thing is to set up an ethos in which the people who you're turning to as sources of information have a lot of authenticity and humility, and the people who are training have a high amount of self-esteem and confidence and know what they're there to get, rather than just assume that if this person has some skill set, then they're magically my status superior in all regards.
No, that's great. That's a great plan there, strategy. I mean, I was engaged to be married to a model in Slovenia, but she was part of a cult. And it was, for me, seeing that the logic of that cult, at least in this situation, maybe not for all cults, but in this situation was, he was the answer to her lack of confidence, and she needed him. And each week that she would see him, he would say, you need to work on X, Y, Z. And so, well, then she's codependent, right? And there's a dependency there. So I would love to be able to talk more with you about, like, how do you implement a good pedagogy that doesn't rely on these kinds of manipulations that cults do, but at the same time draws on the wisdom side of the whole histories of thousands, 10,000, 20,000 years of, 10,000 years of wisdom that we're not even paying attention to. So I think that's a big gap for us to think. Yeah,
through. It's a difficult thing in terms of the pedagogy. And I think partly that's a problem. It's not just a cult problem. It's a problem in regular education and regular teaching and regular business environments and regular politics and all that stuff. So it's a very general problem. At the same time, you could probably compile a list of people who provided even very spiritual seeming experiences and teachings who didn't have a lot of this problem, who did it pretty well. And the main thing to do, I think, would be gather those together and see what they have in common. And then a lot of it is, like we were saying before, the basic individual critical thinking skills that allow you to get some space from the ideology of the economy, from the incoming information and digital communication signals. Those are the same skills you need in order to not get overly immersed in somebody who's got some interesting skills and experiences to share.
No, that's great. Yeah, I love that. And, one of the things, and I'm sure you can relate to this, that you see as a teacher or communicator of wisdom or whatnot, is you see these students come in and they just love Zizek, right? And I've worked with him and still do. And they're like, wow, and they're all obsessed with one person. Or, Judith Butler is the solution to all gender problems that's ever happened. And if you don't agree with her, then you're a fascist or whatever. And you come under I think this is a sign of weakness of one's own dexterity and one's own confidence in developing critical thinking skills, that you need a master, and that the sole master that is the one without fault, and you reify them, and this is a problem. So to be able to diversify that, but without disrespecting people's wisdom, like how does that balance work? And I think that's what a community develops over time, like you said.
Yeah, the lineage element and the respect of people who know things that you don't know is important, especially, you were saying this earlier, I thought it was really pertinent, which is it's difficult, especially when you're essentially still an adolescent in many ways, to figure out how to relate to these things and think through things and get over your early life training and thoughts. And you're going to make some mistakes, and you need role models and you need templates. And you may need to exaggerate their significance to you a little bit in order to really learn from them for a while. So there's a balance there. Zizek is a great example because he's got a kind of charisma, even though he nominally undercuts it all the time. He gets up and, you're castrating me in the Lacanian sense by praising me and all these sort of things. He's bringing it and putting it in everyone's face, but that doesn't stop it from affecting people. They need growth and maturity and whatever helps them develop as a person, and some basic psychoanalytic self-critical skills to see how they deal with transference and projection.
Yeah, that's a great example of Zizek. And yeah, I love, when I teach, I love to be slightly, self undermining and deprecating in some way, just because it's sort of, I think it can relate to your students at different times, not always. Like that can also undermine in some ways yourself, and you don't want that either. But yeah, this is really important. Well, I've really enjoyed our time together, and thank you so much for letting me talk about what is near and dear to my heart. And I love your insights and your challenges to how we can improve. I've learned something here today, and I appreciate your time.
Well, I like that. And this was very nice. I'd love to have another discussion sometime, maybe around spiritual-like pedagogy. Also, a little bit more your take on theology and philosophy generally. But this has been absolutely fantastic. I think everybody's going to learn something. I think Bruce will be thrilled because he's in that position you were describing. He is an underappreciated, underpaid, overworked, artistic, high-level thinker. So he's out there, and there's a lot of people out there that projects like this need to be able to serve because no one else is serving them.
Wow. Yeah. And Bruce, I know you're editing this right now, so it's been really a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks so much.